and welcome to our 2023 speaker series presented by the New Jersey chapter of the Fulbright Association. Today's speaker is Dr. Jorge Heine, who will be introduced by Holger Henke, a member of our New Jersey board. We are pleased to announce that today's presentation is co-sponsored by the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute of Social and Economic Studies, University of the West Indies, Kingston, Jamaica. I'm Pat Hutchinson, president of the New Jersey chapter. This speaker series was established in 2022 to encourage New Jersey Fulbright Association members to introduce themselves and share some of their many experiences and interests with fellow Fulbrighters. We also host invited speakers on timely topics, as we have done for today's webinar: Ukraine, China, and the Second Cold War, active non-alignment in our time. The Fulbright Association is comprised of current and former recipients of Fulbright Awards and supporters of international education. The association represents over 400,000 alumni worldwide. New Jersey has over 300 active Fulbright alumni and friends, as well as thousands of people who live in New Jersey and have traveled abroad on Fulbrights. Additionally, New Jersey has hosted a great many foreign visitors who have come to live and study here. Exchanges benefit our state economically and educationally. In 2021, nearly 20,000 foreign students came to study at New Jersey's colleges and universities. Their economic contributions came to over $617 million to our state. In 2021, roughly 60 New Jerseyans received Fulbright funding for foreign study and teaching. Fulbrighters represent virtually every field of interest and come from over 165 countries. What ties us together is a commitment to advancing mutual understanding, tolerance, and peaceful relations worldwide. Please join me in welcoming Professor Jorge Heine and Professor Holger Henke.
Thank you, Pat. Good afternoon. I'm Holger Henke, Director of the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute for Social and Economic Studies at the Mona campus of the University of the West Indies in Jamaica. Warm greetings from Jamaica, I'm sending. It is my very great pleasure to introduce this afternoon our speaker, Ambassador Dr. Jorge Heine, who is currently affiliated with Boston University. More specifically, Dr. Heine serves as the interim director of Boston University's Frederick S. Pardee Center for the Study of the Longer Range Future. You notice that I said ambassador, and this points us to the fact that Dr. Heine is a practitioner of international diplomacy and foreign policy, but he's also a scholar. On both fronts, he has many successes to show, more than I'm able to mention here in great detail. But suffice it to say that as a practitioner, Jorge has served as ambassador of Chile to South Africa in the mid to late 1990s, to India in the early 2000s, and to China from 2014 to 17, and also as a cabinet minister in the Chilean government. He has taught at Wilfrid Laurier University, at St. Anthony's College at Oxford University, at the University of Constance, and at the University of Paris. Dr. Heine holds an MA and a PhD from Stanford University and has been prolific as an author of no less than 17 books and some 100 journal articles and book chapters. He serves or has served on editorial boards of prestigious journals such as World Affairs. He also served on the board of the Institute of International Relations at the University of the West Indies. Although he was also the president of the Chilean Political Science Association, I know Jorge as the former president of the Caribbean Studies Association, an office I also had the honor of holding some 12 years ago. Jorge and I were both working in China between 2014 and 17, not together, separately, but unfortunately we couldn't find an opportunity to meet while we were there. Big country, tight schedules. I'm all the more ecstatic, therefore, that he has agreed to join us today to talk about some of the topics in his latest book, Latin American Foreign Policies in the New World Order, the Active Non-Alignment Option. Let me close by mentioning that more information about Jorge's work can be found in his website at www.jorgeheine.com. To our viewers, welcome also again. If you have questions, please feel free to put them into the chat and we try to get through as many as possible afterwards. Jorge, welcome. It is good to have you with us today. Tell us, if you would, about how your new book was conceived and the thrust of its main arguments.
Good afternoon, Holger. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Let me thank you and your interest and Pat's interest in making this happen. We have been working on this for quite some time, but you have been unwavering in your commitment to it. One positive outcome of this delay is that the event, in addition to the Fulbright Association of New Jersey, is also being sponsored by the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute of Social and Economic Research at the University of West Indies in Mona, an institution very close to my heart. As Dr. Helga mentioned, we both met originally at the Caribbean Studies Association, of which we were both presidents. I started my career, my academic career, actually in Caribbean studies in Puerto Rico, many years ago, more than I care to remember. And I feel particularly privileged to have this launch today being co-sponsored by the ISCR in Mona. A week ago, we had another launch in St. Augustine at the IIR at the University of West Indies in Trinidad. So I feel like I'm coming home and I'm delighted to be here. At a time when the world is especially troubled, it's important, it seems to me, to think of new ways we can move forward and cope with the very shifting and complex international scenario. And that is what our book is all about. The book came out in February of this year. This is the English edition of the book. It was published by Anthem Press in London, and it's had a pretty good run. It has generated tremendous interest. We have had launches so far in New Delhi, in Pretoria at the roundtable I participated in 10 days ago. As I said earlier, in St. Augustine, and now in Jamaica, and in New Jersey, of course. So, what is this about, and what are we trying to convey in this book? What it is basically is a guide for Latin America in particular, but a lot of my colleagues have argued also for the Global South more generally, how to navigate these very difficult waters that we are facing right now. So I will get into the substance of our proposal in a minute. But first, let me start with a puzzle. I like to tell my students that in political science, the key thing to do before starting any research project, before starting any paper, any thesis, is to be as thorough and as systematic as you can in defining the problem. That is, in asking the right question. If you ask the right question, much else will follow. If it is the wrong question, well, you will be in trouble, and you can do very thorough work, but the result will not necessarily be very encouraging. So, what is the puzzle that we have been contending with in the past year? And that puzzle has to do with the war in Ukraine, a major turning point in international relations, as many observers have pointed out. This is, the bloodiest conflict in Europe since World War II. We all see on our television screens at night the tremendous suffering that is being inflicted on the Ukrainian people. This is a major violation of international law, of the United Nations Charter, of the principles of sovereignty and of non-intervention. And as such, it has been condemned very actively and very straightforwardly by countries in North America, Europe, elsewhere. And this leads me to the question, given all this, and given that, in Latin America, there is a very strong tradition of international law, respect for international law, interest in international law, of respect for multilateralism, a region of the world where the principle of non-intervention is particularly cherished. You would think that Latin American countries would be, on the forefront of siding with NATO, of siding with the G7 on the war in Ukraine. Yet that has not been the case. Some of the major Latin American countries, Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, have taken a much more, some would say ambivalent, others would say ambiguous, others will use other words to describe the attitude of these governments. There are some interesting differences also between the way the ministries of foreign affairs in some cases handle the issue and the way their presidents have handled it. Fascinatingly, the one thing in which there's been some continuity in the foreign policy of Brazil, the only issue in which there's been some continuity in the foreign policy of Brazil between President Bolsonaro and President Lula, has been on the unwillingness to take a strong stance with the West on the issue of the war in Ukraine. Brazil has not done that in both cases. No country in Latin America has voted against the UN resolutions condemning the invasion of Ukraine, yet 4 abstained. Venezuela was not present in the original March 2 vote, March 2, 2022. In the vote to suspend Russia from the Human Rights Council, 9 Latin American countries abstained and 3 voted against the resolution. And the only Latin American country that has supported the political and economic sanctions imposed by the G7 on Russia has been Costa Rica. No other country has done that. So the question becomes, why is that? Why this counterintuitive behavior on something that, according to some observers, should be, a slam dunk, as it were, given Latin America's traditions and the very obvious violation of international law that is taking place and took place in Ukraine after the Russian invasion. So, having posed the puzzle, and I'll come back to answer it further down this talk. Let me hark back to what Dr. Henke asked me when he introduced me and speak a bit about the origins of this notion of active non-alignment and the origins of our book that is just out in its English edition. So, the notion of active non-alignment originated first in 2019 and was developed further in 2020 in an article we published with my colleagues, the co-editors of the book, Carlos Fortin and Carlos Ominami, in 2020 in the journal Foreign Affairs Latin America, which is the Latin America edition of the Foreign Affairs journal published in New York. This is a journal published in Mexico, and in July of the year, we published that piece. And it was framed not obviously by the war in Ukraine, which had not happened at that point. This was 3 years before that, 2 years before that, but it was framed in the context of US-China struggle for primacy, in which Latin America was caught in the middle. Active non-alignment was a bit of a manifesto calling for countries in the region not to give in to pressures from either Washington or Beijing, stick to their own interests and not let themselves be pushed into taking sides, It argued for much greater political cooperation and regional integration in the region at a time when the region was extremely fragmented. Let us remember 2020, of course, was the year of the pandemic. Latin America, as you may or may not know, was the region most severely affected by the pandemic. With 8% of the world's population, Latin America had 30% of the world's deaths from the pandemic. 2020 was the year, according to ECLAC, of the region's worst economic performance in 120 years. GDP in Latin America fell by 6.6% at the time when world GDP fell by 3.3%. This year, projections are that, according to some projections, Latin America will again have negative growth. So, it is not coming out of this very severe crisis very well at all. And so what we were trying to do was to point out that we needed a way forward, that we needed a way out of this very serious situation in which we found ourselves. And to give you an idea of the fragmentation that existed in the region, you may recall that in 2019, as soon as he took office in Brazil, President Bolsonaro, one of the first measures he undertook was for Brazil to leave CELAC. CELAC is the leading umbrella regional organization in Latin America, and Brazil, the biggest country, left it. So that, it seems to me, gives you a pretty good indication of how fragmented and how divided the region was. There was very little cooperation on the pandemic. It was basically every country for itself. No plans of, say, working. You might have thought there might have been some effort, to buy masks and on some sort of joint platform, to buy protective equipment, or later on the vaccines. It was, basically every country for itself, which obviously contributed even more to the crisis. Brazil has the dubious distinction of being the second country after the United States with the highest number of deaths, official deaths from the pandemic, somewhere around 700,000, which in itself tells you something. Peru is the country with the other dubious distinction of having the highest number of deaths per capita in the pandemic. So it's a pretty depressing picture. And what we're trying to say is that Latin America needed a different approach. And here, quite apart from the economic crisis and the health crisis that we lived through, it is also important to keep in mind the degree of international isolation and international, basically irrelevance into which Latin America has been drifting. Today, there's not a single UN agency that is headed by Latin America, not one. This is since Michelle Bachelet left her position as head of the United Nations Human Rights Commission. Listen to this. The World Economic Forum used to have a Latin America chapter. It was closed, lack of interest. The GRULAC, that is the group of Latin American heads of mission at the United Nations in New York, has been basically sidelined. It doesn't participate in any of the most significant debates. Interaction with other regions. This is, a very telling indicator. How eager are the big powers to interact with Latin America? The answer is they are not. Summit of the Americas was supposed to be held in the United States in April of 2021. In many ways, it would have been an ideal moment shortly after the election of President Biden. it was kicked down the road for 14 months, did not take place until June of the next year. The ministerial forum that takes place, between China and Latin America, is supposed to be held every 3 years, was supposed to be held in January of 2021, was not held until December of 2021, kicked down the road again. And our European friends have not had a summit meeting of heads of state with Latin America since 2015. We're talking 8 years now. So what does that tell us? It tells us of a region that has moved from the periphery to utter marginality. It doesn't count in international affairs anymore. And that, it seemed to us, was a recipe for disaster. It would only make things worse. At a time when the international system is undergoing significant changes, well, those that do not participate in the building of the new architecture, well, will be left with whatever's left, some room in the basement, perhaps, while those that do participate in it will obviously have much better quarters and much better facilities. So it wasn't just the overall drift of the region, but also the timing that was particularly worrisome and irksome. Now, it is in this context that we have to look at the pressures in which Latin America found itself from the great powers in this new, in what we call the Second Cold War. And here, there's a very interesting argument. We set forth the argument in July of 2020 that we were facing a second Cold War, this time with China playing the role that the Soviet Union played in the First Cold War. And in that context, we received quite a bit of criticism, and a number of colleagues pointed out and said that this was wrong, that the tensions that we saw, that the differences that we saw between the United States and China were a trade war. Yes, remember, the measures that were taken by the Trump administration, the tariffs that were set up against, the income of Chinese goods. And it was also obviously a tech war. Remember Huawei and the differences on 5G that was so significant. But that it was not an ideological conflict like the First Cold War was, and that it did not have a military dimension, that it was, more of a trade issue, and that our defining it as a second Cold War was quite alarmist, if not downright wrong-headed. Well, 3 years later, the difference between, the West and the rest is being defined by some as the difference between democracy and autocracy. What can be more ideological than that? I would argue that very few things could be so. And moreover, well, we now have a war, which is not a Cold War, it's a hot war in Ukraine, I've already mentioned. But we also have expressions of strong military tensions between the United States and China, and we saw them on the occasion of the visit by Speaker Pelosi to Taiwan in August of last year, which led to significant Chinese military exercises over the island, creating considerable international tensions. So I would argue that the argument that we are, in fact, very much in a second Cold War has been confirmed by developments in the course of the past 3 years. some observers have referred to as being in the foothills of a new Cold War. I say we are climbing the hills pretty fast. And recent developments like what we saw with the globe over the United States, the Chinese globe flying over the United States, that increased tensions quite considerably and led to the cancellation of the visit of Secretary Blinken to China and of a planned visit by Secretary of the Treasury Yellen to China, underscore that issue. And here, a key point is obviously not so much whether the United States and China are willing to engage in some sort of armed conflict. I'm sure none of them is. But what can happen is that there may be an accident. It can be the South China Sea. It can be some other reconnaissance, vehicle that may lead to it, and that is the danger that we are facing. Okay, so in this context, then, Latin American countries have been facing some very serious challenges, and there have been specific projects. There was one that I was particularly involved in, and when I was ambassador in Beijing, and that was to build and install a fiber optic internet trans-Pacific submarine cable from Valparaiso to Shanghai. This was an MOU that was signed. It led to a pre-feasibility study. Then there was a change of government in Chile. I left the embassy, and by 2019, there were very strong pressures from the United States to cancel that project, which it was. There have been a number of projects in Panama, which have also been canceled due to the same reason. So this is not an abstract question. This is something that translates into the canceling of specific major infrastructure projects on the ground. It is in this context, then, that we draw on the autonomy school of Latin American international relations theory, the works of writers such as Elio Jaguaribe from Brazil, Juan Carlos Puig from Argentina, to point out the need for Latin America to exercise its autonomy and not let itself be pressured into siding with one or another of the great powers. But here, I would like to underscore a significant difference, between the situation of what was the non-aligned movement in the 60s and 70s. When we spoke about the third world, today we speak about the global south rather than the third world. And what is the difference between sort of then and now? The difference is that today, of course, we have seen the rise of emerging economies of rising powers like China, like India, like Indonesia, like Brazil at its moment, like Turkey, countries that are really making a mark in the international system, and that make for a very different picture in the global south, what I call the new south. So the basic argument here is that this active non-alignment that we are suggesting, that we are proposing, takes place in an environment in which the South, the developing countries of the world, find themselves in a much stronger position than they did in the 60s and 70s. And let me give you an example. In the 60s and 70s, the big flag, the big demand of developing countries in the NAM was, as you may recall, the new international economic order, the demand to transfer massive amounts of resources from the north to the south to compensate for the exploitation that had taken place during colonialism and imperialism. That demand did not resonate very much There was the Brandt report that looked at it somewhat sympathetically. At the beginning of the Carter administration, there were some rumblings about that this might be something to be considered, but by and large, it didn't lead anywhere. This was what has been called the diplomatie décaillère de doléances. That is, diplomacy as victimhood. We are victims, and reparations are due. Well, today we find ourselves in a very different environment. A key statistic I like to cite to my students is that there are more billionaires in Beijing than there are in New York City. Beijing, of course, is also the site of the headquarters of the Asian Investment and Infrastructure Bank. And in Shanghai, we have, as Dr. Heine knows very well, the new development bank, the so-called BRICS Bank. So what we have is, this is a wonderful term that has been coined by my colleague, Leslie Armijo, collective financial statecraft. And that is the ability of countries in the developing world to rely on their own financial entities that will be able to provide resources to undertake the projects that they want to undertake. So they do not depend just on knocking doors in Washington, Paris, or London. They also can access resources within the global south, within the developing world itself. So that is a very different context from the one that existed 40, 50 years ago. Very well. Now, moving from sort of the structure that lies beneath the current international system to what we might refer to as the agency of countries as they deploy their foreign policy. It is important to underscore the difference between active non-alignment and terms like neutrality and even equidistance. Active non-alignment is not about being neutral. Neutral is a legal term that has implications for the behavior of states when war is being waged, and what type of commerce, what type of trade can be undertaken, whether arms can be delivered or not, and so on and so forth. And Switzerland, as we all know, is coping with that right now. Active non-alignment and non-alignment more generally is not about that. Countries are obviously free to take their positions on various issues. But what it means is that you don't align yourself automatically with one or other of the great powers. You evaluate your foreign policy choices, each of them on an individual basis, and make an informed choice according to what the particular issue entails. This, of course, is much more difficult. It demands more stringent analytical capabilities than just acting according to what you're told. It's much easier to act according to what you're told. It is more challenging to evaluate each issue individually and then move forward accordingly. There is a notion of equidistance that has been set forth, and we have a chapter by leading Argentine political scientist Juan Gabriel Tocatlian in the book, and obviously a difference of interpretation. But again, active non-alignment is not about keeping an equal distance from the great powers. On some issues, for example, it is perfectly possible that, say, on democracy and human rights, you might have in Latin America and elsewhere in the global south a position closer to that of the United States. On other issues, say on international trade, it is perfectly possible to have a position that is closer to China. So, equidistance is not, again, some sort of, mathematical approach that will put you squarely at, sort of the same distance from both. This will vary from issue to issue. Now, what I found particularly fascinating, again, to go back to sort of the history of the book, what happened was we published this article in July of 2020. It generated considerable interest, so much so that we had a webinar in Santiago in August of 2020 with 6 former foreign ministers of Latin American countries, some of the leading countries in Latin America: Mexico, Brazil, Colombia, Peru, Chile, Argentina. And this led to the idea of putting together an edited volume, which we did. And that was published in Spanish in Chile in November of 2021. And the book was launched in 5 countries. We launched in Chile, Argentina, Brazil, Peru, and Canada, and Mexico also had an event on it. And what was very interesting is the debate that it generated. We have published several follow-up articles on it in Argentina, in Spain. The debate and the reviews that came out, around the world. And what some of the reviewers pointed out is that more than a future-oriented proposal, active non-alignment is something that is being applied in practice. That is, that Latin American countries are already evaluating each issue on its merits and refusing to side automatically, either with Washington or with Beijing. And that is, of course, what happened with the case of Huawei, the Chinese telecom giant that is the cutting-edge producer of 5G technology. Many Latin American countries were submitted to strong pressures not to adopt that technology, although it is the most cost-effective and the most advanced. Now, you must realize what this entails. In some cases, it meant, if you would have done that, to take out cables that were already in place and substitute them for, others that were more expensive and, less efficient. Now, obviously, that was not a very sound business proposition. And in fact, it didn't get anywhere, and most countries proceeded to allow Huawei to participate in the 5G bids that were held in various countries. Brazil originally said, under Bolsonaro originally said, okay, we will ban it. And then they backtracked and said, well, we will allow it, which they did. And there was one particular instance which reflected this, sort of ANA being applied in practice. And that was the Summit of Democracies. The second Summit of Democracies was just held, of course, but the first Summit of Democracies was held in DC in December of 2021. And a week earlier, the China Latin America Ministerial Forum was held virtually in Mexico City. And most Latin American governments participated in both, and they saw no conflict in doing so. They didn't think that they had to choose between participating in the Summit of Democracies in Washington and in this ministerial forum at foreign ministers level with China in Mexico City, and they, engaged in both. And in Foreign Affairs, Brian Winter, who reviewed the book, referred to it as the region's most significant foreign policy development since the end of the Cold War. And in its year-end balance of the year 2022, Foreign Policy magazine, another leading magazine in foreign affairs, called 2022 in Latin America the year of non-alignment. So again, more than a manifesto, this was considered a finding of sorts, sort of establishing what is actually happening in the region. Now, to go back to the initial puzzle that I posed to you at the beginning of this talk, what I would like to convey to you is that this apparently, puzzling reaction in Latin America to the war in Ukraine is not because of, happenstance, is not because Latin American leaders feel at a loss as to what to do. No, it is because they are, basically acting without calling it that way. But they are basically applying, active non-alignment. They are realizing that this is a European war, that there's no reason why they should get involved. I mean, we had the recent visit by German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, who visited Chile, Brazil, and Argentina. And the main reason for his visit, in Chile, 10 years had gone by from the previous visit of the German Chancellor. And the main reason for this visit was to ask Latin American countries to provide weapons to Ukraine. Now, Latin American countries have been reluctant to endorse and, in fact, refuse to endorse economic and diplomatic sanctions. Now, countries that refuse to endorse diplomatic and economic sanctions are being asked to provide weapons. I mean, I thought it was really a stretch. And this was asked both by Germany and by the United States, and was unanimously rejected. Providing weapons would make these countries into belligerents in the war. And the war's outcome is still uncertain. And there was little reason why this should actually happen. And in fact, it didn't. Now, as I said earlier, I've been in the past month, I've been in India and I've been in South Africa discussing this topic. And I've seen firsthand that this notion of active non-alignment is limited to Latin America. It is also very much present in Asia and in Africa. So active non-alignment arose in the context of the US-China spat, and the conflict with Russia has its own features, but shares others, including the dynamic of sort of the West versus the rest. India plays a key role in it, having discovered its non-aligned roots despite closer ties in the recent past with the United States. 17 African countries abstained in the United Nations General Assembly vote to condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The role of the BRICS, that in many ways embodies the new South that has emerged in the new century, is critical. Now, as often happens, it is the German language that has provided us with the perfect word to define this period, and Chancellor Scholz has called it eine Zeitenwende. The German language has this great advantage over most other languages that you can actually paste words together and use them in a variety of ways. So we get Weltanschauung and Fingerspitzengefühl, and we now get Zeitenwende, which means a change of epoch. And it seems to me that what we have seen in the course of the past year in this tripolar Cold War that we are witnessing, far from weakening the argument for active non-alignment, it strengthens it. Active non-alignment provides a useful compass, a guide to action in a turbulent world, opening the possibility of finding a common posture in Latin America, one that would also strengthen the relations with the rest of the world. There would, of course, be no agreement on signing up either with Washington or Beijing or Moscow. And ANA remains the most attractive option in this setting. In that context, what we have seen in the past year and a half in Latin America with the election of a number of progressive leaders who are committed to regional cooperation and to regional integration in a way that their predecessors were not, open some interesting possibilities, it seems to me. And the role that we are seeing President Lula play in putting forward a peace proposal for Ukraine. President Lula visited Washington, discussed this with President Biden, although he disagreed on it. He has also spoken, President Lula has spoken with President Zelensky on the phone, the Ukrainian president, on it. And Celso Amorim, who was Lula's foreign minister in his first 2 terms in office and is now his foreign affairs advisor in Planalto. And Celso Amorim has the closing chapter in our book on Brazil and the Global South. Mr. Amorim will be traveling to, it has been announced, will be traveling to Moscow to explore further the possibility of the Brazilian peace mediation effort. And, it seems to us that Brazil's initiative shows active non-alignment at its best. Brazil has not taken a stance of siding with the G7, with NATO. It has kept its option open. It has, acted in a non-aligned fashion, but at the same time, it has not become a passive actor. It has said that Brazil wants to contribute to bringing peace to Ukraine, and has come up with a proposal that will be discussed in days and weeks to come. Let me finally close with some reflections on the Caribbean. In the book, Jorge Castañeda, former foreign minister of Mexico and one of Latin America's leading intellectuals, he teaches at New York University and has written many significant books and is a well-known commentator. He makes the case that active non-alignment is an interesting notion, but that we should keep in mind that it is most relevant to South America rather than to the countries in and around the Caribbean basin. The argument being that the countries in the Caribbean and Central America and Mexico itself are much more dependent on and much more integrated to the North American and particularly the US economy. And that makes it for them much more difficult to take an all-aligned stance for reasons of not just economic, reasons, but also social, cultural, and so on and so forth, migration flows, also remittances, all sorts of things. And that is, an argument that has obviously some merit. But, reflecting upon it, I found it interesting, and I thought that's why I wanted to close on this note, that if we look back at the 70s and 80s, a number of Caribbean countries played a key role in the non-aligned movement. And Holger is in Jamaica, and IACR is one of the co-sponsors of this event. Well, Michael Manley was a very significant leader in the non-aligned movement. Maurice Bishop in Grenada, Guyanese diplomats played a very significant role in the non-aligned movement. So, there's a history there that seems somewhat to counter this, in many ways, quite logical argument that Jorge Castañeda makes. I was also struck by something that I found very interesting in the recent Summit of the Americas. There was a strong pushback towards the notion that some countries would be excluded from participating in the summit, that they were not being invited. And, originally CARICOM voted not to participate in the Summit of the Americas for that reason. In the end, that didn't happen. But a number of Caribbean and a number of Central American countries didn't go to the Summit of the Americas for this reason, although most South American leaders did. So I would like to leave you with that thought as to what role the Caribbean could play in a policy of active non-alignment. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Jorge. That was a far-reaching, wide-ranging conversation that you led us into. China, Taiwan, United States, Latin America, Ukraine, Europe. We are all over the map, really, in the relevance of what you're putting forward then in terms of your talk. I'm inviting all the our listeners and participants to put forward any questions you may have into the chat area for Jorge to answer. And while you may be thinking about what to ask, there's so many options, I know. Maybe I take the privilege of the chair to ask a question, but actually I wanted to invite you first, Jorge, to just talk a little bit more. You talked in the context of Huawei. talk about a bit about the socio-economic impact that China's foreign direct investment in the global south has or can have. Of course, they have the Belt and Road Initiative, by which they are going around in Asia a lot, but really going beyond, going to Africa, Latin America, other places. What does it mean in practical terms? The kind of development projects that China offers, the kind of foreign investments that it proposes to engage with partners in the global south?
Sure. Well, let me say this. The basic point here to keep in mind is that what China has put on the table in terms of the Belt and Road Initiative, this is something that 21 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean have signed on to. It is basically about infrastructure and connectivity. The idea is to build up, highways, railways, ports, bridges, tunnels, which is what China has done in China. And it is basically, covered with cement, as you might have seen, Helge, most of the plant in China. And now Chinese construction companies need to go elsewhere to do something similar. And they are saying they can do that in the global south. They can do that in Africa. They can do it in Asia. They can do it in Latin America. And that is something that points to a real need. As you may recall, the World Bank in the 60s and 70s was into infrastructure building, but something happened and they basically gave up on it and moved to soft issues like health, education, poverty alleviation, and left infrastructure building behind. As a result, there's an enormous deficit in infrastructure in many countries in the global south, and China has stepped in to attempt to remedy that. Obviously, this doesn't happen one day to the next, but in the 10 years that we have seen the BRI in action, it has done quite a bit.
Okay, thank you. I'm still waiting for any panelists to step forward, for any participants to step forward, have any questions for Jorge. I think this is a fascinating conversation, fascinating talk. You mentioned, of course, Michael Manley and Bishop in Grenada and others in the Caribbean, in Guyana, Cuba, who led in the 1970s the call for a new international order. Were part of the non-aligned movement back then. Nowadays, we have, of course, in Barbados, a very strong voice in the with the current Prime Minister Mia Mottley there, making very strong arguments in international forums for AMA stance to be taken, certainly by her country and by extension other Caribbean countries. Jorge, I'm quite aware that as ever so often the United States are aggressively and insensitively, I should add, pursuing, if not even trying to impose a particular agenda vis-a-vis China and Russia. But I'm also wondering whether the active non-alignment premise, namely that the United States and Europe are forming one formidable alliance in this pursuit, and the resulting simulacrum of equidistance, you made the case there's no equidistance really, from these perceived blocks, from all perceived blocks really. If that doesn't tend to gloss over a little bit, that there are very significant disagreements between and even within European countries, and for that matter within Taiwan too, and that several countries are far from supporting the United States. So the current stance, for example, the European Union is taking regarding the war in Ukraine is far more driven by Eastern European countries, who have, of course, vivid memories of Soviet rule, than by some of the previously significant players, such as France and Germany, where there's much more nuance and significant resistance to simply isolating China or trying to completely defeat Russia on the Ukrainian battlefield. I'm pretty sure actually with Easter coming up soon, you will have the traditional Easter marches making that point very visibly in the media in several European countries. So I'm wondering if the premise of the active non-aligned movement does not pay sufficient attention to the the fine differences that are actually existing within what we may call a bloc.
I think those are very good points, and obviously the differences between the position taken by countries like Lithuania or Latvia and those taken by, say, Germany or France are quite significant. Now, that said, it seems to me it's important to keep in mind that the situation in which NATO found itself under President Trump, subjected to strong tensions, and the situation under President Biden, in which NATO is much more unified than it was, 3 or 4 years ago. So in that sense, I would argue that the war in Ukraine has contributed very strongly to the growing unity of NATO, despite the differences that you quite rightly mentioned. Now, again, to go back to the argument that has been made, that the war in Ukraine would underline that the main cleavage in the world would be between democracy and autocracy. I would argue that that is not the case at all. Why? Because some of the largest democracies in the world, like India, like Indonesia, like Pakistan, like South Africa, like Brazil, like Mexico, are not endorsing the position of NATO, are not siding with the G7. They've taken a different position. So I would argue that what the war in Ukraine has really shown is that the biggest cleavage in the world is not so much in democracy and autocracy, but between North and South, between the global North and the global South. And that, it seems to me, is something that we have to keep in mind.
Thank you. I just got a message from somebody saying that chat is disabled for her. I encourage the person to put her question into the Q&A area instead. I hope that will work. I don't know if Christine left us, so I'm not sure how we're addressing that issue. Pat, I don't know if we can have anybody actually speak in the... Can we activate their audio? All right, maybe if we try once, as we're trying to figure that out, I think this was Judy Nygaard who wanted to pose a question. Judy, if you're still there, I'm encouraging you to use the question and answer field in our chat, in our meeting. So Jorge, I think Shakespeare proclaimed that comparisons are odious. So we're always doing them, and probably for some reason. So nevertheless, with a view to the current war in Ukraine, a war with very tangible consequences, also I would say for the global South, I'm wondering how wrong or how accurate it is to compare it to another major historical crisis in the center of Europe that arguably also had globally felt consequences. I'm referring to the Sudeten crisis of 1938, when Hitler, immediately following the annexation of Austria, also claimed parts of Czechoslovakia as belonging to Germany because of the German language speaking populations prevalent in these parts of that country.
Yes.
Of course, Chamberlain and Daladier's agreement on that claim would forever be considered by historians as a negative example of appeasement. How do we compare that to Ukraine? And why is an active non-alignment stance on it not reminiscent to appeasement?
Yes, this is a question that is often posed, and one of the most frequent parallels that is made is between, today and what happened in the late 30s, with the implications being that, well, today Ukraine, tomorrow, perhaps the rest of Europe. I am not quite sure that the parallel holds. The situation of Ukraine, a former, Soviet province, is, I would argue, quite different. But let me just quote on this Indian Foreign Minister Jaishankar, whom I met in my recent visit to India, and who released my book there. He has a phrase, it seems to me, that reflects very well the problem that we are facing. He has said that the time has long passed in which Europe could consider that Europe's problems were the world's problems, but that the world's problems were not Europe's. The way it is seen by many countries in the global south is that this is a European war that should be solved by Europeans. The notion that this should become a global war in which all 200 countries around the world should somehow pitch in and supporting Ukraine to defeat Russia is not something that is universally shared. It is a tragic war, but so are many other wars around the world. The war in Yemen has cost 250,000 deaths so far. Nobody has called to exclude Saudi Arabia from the SWIFT system or to have a global embargo against Saudi Arabia. There's a reason for that, and that is because that is happening in the south rather than in the north. So it seems to me Foreign Minister Jaishankar's reflection is something to keep in mind.
Mm-hmm. I know there's of course the question of oil as well, right? Yeah. Well, I'm very sorry that we may not be able to hear questions. I'm again asking participants either to try the chat, or if that's not possible for some reason, I don't know why, the question and answer section in our conversation. Jorge, I'm not quite running out of questions yet. But would you care to tell us a bit more about your home country, Chile? How is it positioning itself with regard to active non-alignment and the issues that were raised in your talk?
Sure. Well, it goes to show that in Latin America today, there is a variety of views on this. As I mentioned to you, some of the leading countries in Latin America, like Argentina, like Brazil, like Colombia, like Mexico, have taken a studiously neutral stance on the war. In the case of Chile, President Boric has taken a somewhat different stance. He has spoken with President Zelensky and has been much more sympathetic to NATO's position and to the G7. So, there are variations in the case of Latin America. As I said earlier, Costa Rica, for example, has also endorsed the application of diplomatic and economic sanctions on Russia. So this is, by no means a uniform region-wide position, but it is the position that is emerging among some of the leading countries in the region.
Okay, thank you. Pat, I think you would have at least a voice, if not, if you weren't able to type in anything.
Well, I have to say that I am very interested in what you were saying about the comparison to, the drama that we all feel about the comparisons of the Russians to the Germans in a former day. And I think that, your observations on those are really, really enlightening to me, particularly in that tomorrow I will be greeting the Ukrainian family that we're sponsoring coming over. I think there will be some good conversations there.
Yes.
There is, of course, also considerable, as maybe muted criticism in Russia. Many are voting with their feet, going to Western Europe to seek asylum there. A lot of young men have been leaving Russia through southern borders, maybe through Turkey, some of these places. So there too you have a muted criticism going on there in Russia. Jorge, at this point, I don't have any follow-up questions to you, and I'm still not seeing anybody in the chat. So I'd say this is the last opportunity I'm making available for everybody. But I certainly want to thank you so much for your this afternoon. Continue the good work. We certainly understand in the Global South that to extend the range of options for development in particular is the order of the day. Life here is much less about thinking about the future than the daily survival, and is dominated by those necessities of environmental catastrophes. We were looking at the new hurricane season coming soon. It's something that's affecting more and more the North American continent as well. So there should be areas also for common interests that we should explore more in the future. But generally speaking, development is, and things are not looking too rosy, even though the economy per se may show signs of rebounding out of the COVID crisis, talking here about Jamaica. But you know, it does not necessarily translate into the everyday lives of many people. And that's really where, for many countries in the Global South, the priorities lie. And so therefore, if you can find ways to extend, you know, options for development and options for international cooperation, and that certainly is an important area for the South to continue pushing for, I think. So thank you for your...
Very good. Thank you for the opportunity. Have a good evening.
Thank you. There's a message I'm seeing now. Oh, it's from Pat. Thank you. Also saying from Pat Hutchinson, on behalf of the New Jersey chapter, New Jersey Fulbright Association chapter, and the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute for Social Economic Studies at the University of West Indies. Thank you so much, and I thank all the participants for attending this afternoon. We will have recorded, and with your permission, Jorge,
Sure, of course.
Thank you. We put this video on our Facebook website in the coming couple of weeks, maybe. All right.
Terrific. Thank you so much. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Your book cover.
Hmm?
I would like to see Jorge's book.
You have it?
Yes.
Okay. Bring it up. Very good.
Very good. Thank you, Pat.
Thank you.
All right. Good.
There we are. Very good. Okay. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. Thank you, Holger. Thank you, Christine.
Bye-bye.